Her son whispered at the funeral, "Finally, freedom." Elaine Rivers, 76, widow of a Navy veteran and mother of one, didn't flinch. By the time he finished posing for photos beside the casket, his inheritance was already gone. She wouldn't raise her voice. She'd raise documents. And when he came clawing for control, she handed him silence and a trust he could never break. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The scent of lilies clung to the air, thick, cloying, a sweetness that felt more like disguise than comfort. Elaine Rivers stood beside the closed casket, hands folded neatly around a folded handkerchief she hadn't used. The funeral home lights were dim, the kind that made everything and everyone look slightly waxen. She stared at the polished wood, at her husband's engraved nameplate, trying to match the man she'd buried to the man the mourners spoke of. Generous, respected, a pillar of the community. Every condolence was a script. He was such a good man. You two were the perfect couple. You must feel so lost. Elaine nodded, smiled faintly, whispered, "Thank you," in that soft, careful voice she'd perfected over 45 years of holding her tongue. Then Gavin leaned in from behind her shoulder. His cologne, sharp, synthetic, cut through the funeral flowers. His lips barely moved. "Finally," he murmured, voice smooth and venomous. "Freedom." Elaine's body went still. The handkerchief slipped from her fingers and brushed against her shoe. When she turned her head, he was already walking away. Tall, confident, a faint smile tugging at his mouth as if he'd just delivered the punchline of a private joke. Laura was by the guest book, dabbing her eyes with tissues and glancing sideways to make sure people saw. "He was like a father to me," she said to an older couple, her tone wobbling on cue. The couple patted her arm sympathetically. Elaine didn't move, didn't breathe. The room blurred into the hum of polite conversation, of paper cups and whispered gossip. Her husband's coffin was 10 feet away, but the words, "Finally," "freedom," echoed louder than the pastor's final blessing. A touch on her elbow. Marcia King. "You look pale as a ghost," her old friend said quietly. "Want me to get you some water?" Elaine blinked, refocused on the face she'd known since grade school. "No, no, I'm fine." Marcia's eyes narrowed. "You're lying." But before Elaine could answer, someone called Marcia to sign the condolence register. The moment broke like fragile glass. Outside, clouds pressed low over Boise, gray and heavy with early snow. Elaine stood under the awning as the last guests drifted toward their cars. Gavin and Laura posed near the hearse for a photograph Laura insisted was for the family records. Elaine watched her son's hand slide around his wife's waist, his smile professional, empty. She wondered if anyone else could see the calculation behind his eyes. When the hearse door closed, the sound snapped like a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't wanted to finish. That night the house was too quiet. Every clock ticked like an accusation. The casserole dishes lined the counter like offerings to a god she didn't believe in. Elaine removed her black coat and hung it neatly on the same hook her husband had used for decades. His hat still hung beside it, waiting, unaware. She poured tea she didn't drink, sat in her husband's recliner and stared at the television that wasn't on. The hollow space beside her rang with everything unspoken. Finally, she rose. The movement was deliberate, her body remembering purpose. She crossed the hallway to the den, where an old metal filing cabinet crouched in the corner. Dented, humming faintly under the floor vent. It hadn't been opened in years. Her husband had guarded it like a vault, insisting on locking every drawer, labeling nothing. Elaine knelt beside it, her knees protesting. The key still hung on the small ring attached to the inside of his desk drawer. She turned it in the lock. The drawer groaned open. Inside were folders, legal envelopes, yellowed notepads, thick manila files bound with brittle rubber bands. Her hand hovered over one labeled simply, Rivers Estate. Updated. In the distance, wind rattled the loose siding of the porch. Somewhere outside, a car engine idled and then faded into the night. Elaine exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. Finally, freedom, her son had said. She brushed dust from the folder, eyes hardening. We'll see, she whispered. The lamp beside her flickered once, then steadied. She opened the top drawer wider and began to read. The house creaked in its sleep, a restless kind of silence. Elaine sat cross-legged on the den rug, the folder spread open before her like an autopsy. Pages rustled softly, the only sound besides the occasional tick from the mantel clock. Her husband's handwriting, neat, deliberate, unmistakable, threaded across the first document. Updated will and testament of Robert L. Rivers, 2024. The sight of his signature made something tighten behind her ribs. She touched the ink with one fingertip, as if to be sure it was real. Clause after clause, the language was precise. A living trust, conditions, amendments, dates she hadn't known he'd gone to see Dean Rourke, their family attorney. Robert had built his life around predictability, but this was the work of a man who'd anticipated a storm. The second folder held investment summaries, account statements, a sealed envelope addressed in her husband's handwriting. For Dean Rourke, to be delivered by Elaine. The paper was heavy, official. Not a love letter, not nostalgia, purpose. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her tea mug. The glow lit up the room in short pulses. A message from Gavin. Let me know when the inheritance stuff's ready. We should streamline things. Streamline. The word snapped through her like static. 45 years of shared life had turned into stuff. She didn't reply. She locked the screen, slid the phone face down. Instead, she reached for a pen and wrote Dean's name on a notepad, underlining it twice. He'd know what this meant. He'd also know how dangerous it could become once Gavin realized control wasn't his birthright. A knock came at the side door, soft, familiar. Elaine hesitated before crossing the kitchen. Through the frosted glass, she saw Marcia's silhouette, bundled in a heavy coat, holding a plastic container. Elaine opened the door, and a swirl of cold air followed her friend in. I brought soup, Marcia said, setting the container on the counter. Chicken and rice. You probably haven't eaten. Elaine managed a small smile. You're right about that part. Marcia's gaze drifted toward the den. Couldn't sleep, huh? Lights were on all night when I drove by. Elaine hesitated. Just sorting through things. Marcia moved closer, curiosity sharpening her tone. That cabinet? The one he never let anyone touch? Elaine didn't answer immediately. She poured 2 mugs of tea instead, her motions deliberate. Then she gestured toward the den. Go on. Take a look. Marcia stepped to the doorway, eyes widening at the scattered folders. Good Lord, Laney, that looks like the county clerk's office exploded in here. Elaine's lips twitched, a ghost of amusement. He kept everything, even secrets. Marcia picked up one envelope, then carefully put it back. What's that one? Something for Dean Rourke, Elaine said. Sealed. I'm not opening it until I know I have to. Marcia turned to her, voice gentler now. You planning something? Elaine met her gaze squarely. I'm planning to make him earn his freedom. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The furnace hummed to life, warm air sighing through the vents. Marcia nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Then you'd better eat something first. You'll need your strength. Elaine sat again on the rug, spooning soup absently as Marcia settled beside her. Outside, wind brushed against the windows, scattering dead leaves across the porch. After a while, Marcia stood. You want me to stick around? No, Elaine said softly. This part I need to do alone. When the door closed behind her friend, Elaine returned to the papers. The legal phrasing blurred as her mind raced ahead. Gavin's smug smile, Laura's practiced sympathy, the quiet power in Robert's final planning. She sealed the envelope again inside a manila folder and whispered to the empty room, "He thought he'd won already." The clock struck midnight, a hollow sound that filled the den. Elaine opened a fresh file labeled Trust Distribution, Contingent Clauses, and her breath caught. A paragraph underlined twice, in her husband's careful hand. In the event of contest, all rights of inheritance are void. Elaine's eyes widened. The faintest satisfied smile touched her mouth. From the kitchen, her phone buzzed again, Gavin's name glowing insistently across the screen. She didn't touch it. She reached forward, switched off the lamp, and sat in the dark. Somewhere between the steady tick of the clock and the whisper of wind outside, she realized it wasn't grief she felt anymore. It was preparation. Morning came gray and brittle, the kind of light that made everything look colder than it was. Elaine hadn't slept. The papers from the night before were still scattered across the den rug, a neat chaos that reflected the inside of her mind. The sealed envelope lay at the center, its edges faintly curled from age. She turned it over in her hands, tracing her husband's handwriting. For Dean Rourke. To be delivered by Elaine. For hours she'd stared at it, debating whether to open it herself or honor his instruction to deliver it unopened. But Robert had known her better than anyone. If he'd trusted her with this much, then maybe he'd known she'd need what was inside before anyone else saw it. Her hands shook as she slit the envelope open with a kitchen knife. The sound was small, but it felt like breaking a seal on something sacred. Inside was a single typed page, folded around a handwritten note. The note came first. Robert's voice in ink. Elaine, if you're reading this, I've gone ahead of you, as we both knew I would. I've left provisions to make sure you're never cornered. Not by him, not by anyone. This clause is for your protection, and mine. Her throat closed. She read it again, slower. Not our protection. Your protection. She unfolded the typed document beneath it. Legal phrasing, cross-references, a conditional inheritance clause with language so precise it could cut glass. Gavin's inheritance, contingent upon demonstrable responsibility. No debt beyond mortgage value. No criminal or civil filings against the estate. Completion of verified community service hours within 1 year of probate. And most critical of all, if the heir contests, disputes, or attempts to alter any provision of this will, all entitlements are rendered null and void. Elaine sat back hard, the chair creaking under her. For the first time since the funeral, she smiled, a small, restrained thing that looked almost foreign on her face. The phone on the desk blinked with a missed call notification. Dean Rourke. She dialed back immediately. His voice, when he answered, was calm and measured. The same voice that had guided them through every mortgage, every insurance renewal, every bit of red tape life threw at them. Elaine, he said. I was just about to check on you. I found something, she said. A letter. It's addressed to you, but I read it first. There was a pause. Robert's handwriting? Yes. And a clause. She read it aloud, every word clear. When she finished, there was silence on the other end. The kind that stretches, not from confusion, but calculation. Finally, Dean said, That's an airtight condition under Idaho law. He knew what he was doing. So it stays? It stays, Dean said firmly. He's protected you from a contest before it can start. Gavin won't see it coming. Elaine exhaled, a sound that carried relief and grief in equal measure. Then it stays. Dean's tone softened. You did the right thing opening it. Bring it by my office tomorrow. We'll get everything notarized. When the call ended, she placed the letter back into its envelope and pressed her fingers over Robert's signature. The paper was warm from her touch. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft, quiet flakes drifting past the window. Boise's sky was the color of unpolished steel. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification. Laura Rivers posted a new photo. Elaine opened it without thinking. A picture of Laura at her kitchen table, chin propped on her hand, a mug of tea artfully placed beside a laptop. The caption read, "Grieving through paperwork. So proud of my husband for handling everything with such grace. Family legacy. Healing together." Elaine stared at the photo, the hashtags, the deliberate softness in Laura's eyes. The props, the staged mug, the folded tissue. It wasn't grief. It was performance. Her thumb hovered over the like button. Then she locked the phone and set it aside. Through the window, the first real flakes began to stick, clinging to the glass in fragile white clusters. Elaine whispered to herself, "Let it snow. Let it bury everything that deserves it." She folded the clause, slid it into a fireproof folder, and locked it in the cabinet once more. Then she turned off the lamp, stood in the silence, and for the first time, didn't feel small in her own house. The faint buzz of her phone echoed again, Gavin's name lighting up the screen, the preview line reading, "We should talk. I've got plans for Dad's estate." Elaine stared at it for a long moment. Then she smiled, slow and certain. By late afternoon, the snow had turned to a cold drizzle that streaked the kitchen windows like thin gray veins. Elaine sat at the table, a legal pad before her, coffee cooling untouched beside it. She'd already called Dean that morning, and his precise, reassuring voice still echoed in her head. "We'll handle the filings quietly. By the time Gavin realizes what's locked, it'll be too late." The doorbell rang. Once, twice, sharp, impatient. Elaine rose slowly, wiping her palms on her sweater before opening the door. Gavin stood there, smiling, the kind of grin that was meant to pass as warmth but never reached his eyes. He was wearing a pressed overcoat, shoes too expensive for slush. "Hey, Mom," he said, voice soft, almost rehearsed. "Thought I'd check on you. You've been quiet." Elaine stepped aside without answering, motioning him in. "Coffee's still hot, if you want some." "Sure," he said, glancing around the kitchen as if appraising its worth. "Laura was worried you might be overwhelmed with all the estate stuff. You know, paperwork, finances, all that mess." Elaine poured his coffee and handed it to him. "Nothing's finalized yet," she said evenly. He leaned against the counter, casual. "Yeah, I figured. But Dad was always organized. Shouldn't take long, right? Just a few signatures, a few transfers." He smiled over the rim of his mug. "You know me, I like efficiency." Elaine sipped her own coffee, eyes calm. Efficiency can be dangerous when you don't know what you're handling. For a flicker of a second, the charm slipped. "I just mean, I can help. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone. We can sit down with Dean, talk about assets, the trust, all that." She set her mug down gently. "Dean's already on top of it. I spoke to him this morning." His brow furrowed. "Without me?" "You're not the executor, Gavin. I am." The silence between them hummed like an electrical wire. Then, forcing a chuckle, he said, "Of course. Just figured you'd keep me in the loop. It's mine eventually, anyway." Elaine's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, a voice came from the back porch. "You're assuming a lot, aren't you?" Marcia stepped through the open door, shaking rain from her umbrella. She wore her trademark red scarf and that unfiltered confidence that made even Gavin straighten his posture. He rolled his eyes slightly. "Afternoon, Marcia." "Afternoon, nothing," she said, hanging her coat. I just stopped by to drop off some of those thank you cards you asked for. Elaine. She glanced between them. Didn't realize you had company. Just my son, Elaine said smoothly. I can see that. Marcia set the cards on the table, then looked straight at Gavin. Funny, you've got a talent for showing up when money's involved. Excuse me? You heard me, she said, crossing her arms. Maybe try showing up when someone needs a shoulder, not a signature. Gavin's polite facade cracked. You've got some nerve. Marcia cut him off. And you've got your mother's patience wearing thin. Elaine stood before it escalated. That's enough, she said quietly, but her tone held authority. Marcia, thank you for bringing the cards. Marcia hesitated, then nodded. You call me later, okay? Her look carried weight, the kind of silent warning women shared when they saw trouble brewing. When the door closed behind her, Gavin's expression soured. She's always had it out for me. She's always seen through you, Elaine replied softly. He bristled, placing his mug down harder than necessary. You think Dad would have wanted you hoarding everything, hiding behind lawyers? He trusted me with this family's future. Your father trusted me with his legacy, she corrected. He stared at her for a long moment, eyes narrowing. You think you can control me with paperwork? I don't need to control you, she said, voice calm but cold. I just need to make sure you can't control me. Gavin grabbed his coat. This isn't over, Mom. The front door slammed. The sound echoed through the house long after his car pulled away. Elaine exhaled slowly, then crossed to the small safe in the den. She removed a few folders, the will, the trust deed, Robert's handwritten note, and placed them in a plain envelope. That evening, she drove through the drizzle to the downtown credit union. The teller recognized her from years of joint deposits and condolences. Evening, Mrs. Rivers. Need to make a deposit? Elaine smiled faintly. Something like that. The clerk led her to a small room lined with numbered metal doors. The safe deposit box clicked open with a satisfying metallic sound. She placed the envelope inside, closed the drawer, and turned the key. As she stepped back outside, the drizzle had turned to mist. Streetlights cast halos on the wet pavement. For the first time in days, she felt something like steadiness return. But when she got home, her phone blinked with a new message. From Gavin. You shouldn't make moves behind my back, Mom. I'm not stupid. Elaine read it twice, then deleted it. She poured herself another cup of coffee, sat by the window, and whispered, No, you're not stupid, Gavin. Just careless. Outside, the rain deepened into a steady rhythm, the kind that promised a storm still coming. The letter from the county courthouse arrived on a Thursday morning, the kind of morning when the sky looked bleached and brittle, like paper left too long in the sun. Elaine recognized the envelope before she even touched it. Official seal. Heavy cardstock. Probate division. Ada County. She carried it into the kitchen, laid it on the counter, and stared at it while the kettle hissed. She didn't open it until her tea had steeped, her breathing steady. Inside were the words she'd expected, but not the ones she'd wanted. Notice of petition to contest will. Filed by Gavin Rivers. Elaine read it twice. The air felt colder somehow, though the heater had kicked on. The motion was formal, legalistic, but its meaning was simple. Her son was trying to erase his father's last wishes. She reached for her phone and called Dean. He picked up on the first ring. You got the notice? Yes. Her voice was calm. He went through with it. There was a pause, then a measured exhale on the other end. Good. Then we do too. By the time she reached Dean's office that afternoon, the sky had darkened into a bruised gray. His assistant ushered her in quietly, and Dean stood from behind his desk, suit jacket draped over his chair, sleeves rolled up as if he'd been expecting battle. He gestured toward the file open on his desk. It's official. Gavin's attorney filed at 9:42 a.m., contesting validity based on undue influence. He's arguing that Robert's last changes weren't made of sound mind. Elaine's lips pressed into a thin line. He's calling his father delusional now? Dean gave a faint, humorless smile. In legal terms, yes. He turned the page and tapped the signature line. But that motion activates a clause your husband wrote himself. I've already filed the counter notice. He slid a copy across the desk. The clause was right there, in bold print, her husband's words underlined twice. In the event of contest, all rights of inheritance are void. Elaine read it slowly, savoring each word. So, by challenging it, Dean nodded. He's disqualified himself. It's immediate and irreversible. Elaine's expression didn't change, but something inside her settled, like a lock turning in place. Dean leaned back. He'll find out soon enough. His attorney will call him within the hour. Outside, the wind pressed against the office windows, scattering dry leaves down the street. Elaine watched them swirl like confetti from a victory no one would celebrate. What happens next? She asked. We finalize the trust, Dean said. The assets are secure. But there's the question of what to do with Gavin's former share. Elaine tilted her head. Former share. The phrase lingered on her tongue like something rich and dark. Dean smiled faintly. Has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? When Elaine left his office, she didn't drive straight home. Instead, she stopped at a small stationery shop on Main Street and bought a stack of ivory envelopes and matching letterhead. Back at the house, she sat at the dining table where she and Robert had once balanced their checkbooks and wrote out a heading in steady, elegant script. Donation proposal. Rivers Family Veterans Foundation Fund. Her husband had served 22 years in the Navy. It was the one part of him Gavin had never respected. The discipline, the humility, the idea of service without reward. Elaine folded the first draft neatly and slid it into an envelope, pressing the seal closed with her thumb. As she gathered the rest of her papers, a sudden vibration rolled across the table, her phone, buzzing with a text from Marcia. Turn on the news. They're saying Gavin just filed against the will. Elaine smiled faintly. Already handled. Another buzz followed seconds later, this time from Laura. I can't believe this. You said this would be easy. Elaine could almost hear Laura's voice through the punctuation, shrill, incredulous. She imagined the scene, their kitchen in chaos. Laura pacing with her phone, Gavin fuming, his own arrogance finally cornered. Elaine didn't respond. She closed the message and slipped her phone into her sweater pocket. At sunset, she walked into the den and lit the small lamp on Robert's desk. The light glowed against the brass nameplate he'd kept from his Navy days, duty before self. She whispered, You'd have liked this part. The house was still, the quiet no longer oppressive but earned. The phone rang again, the old landline, the one she kept for calls that mattered. She lifted the receiver. Elaine? Dean's voice, calm but with a note she hadn't heard before, something almost conspiratorial. The paperwork's filed. Gavin's challenge is null. You're in the clear. She closed her eyes, relief washing through her. Thank you, Dean. He hesitated, then added, There's one more thing. Since his share is voided, it can be legally redirected. Do you want to choose where it goes? Elaine's eyes drifted to the envelope she'd just sealed, Rivers Family Veterans Foundation Fund. Her lips curved into the faintest decisive smile. Dean, she said softly, I already have. The pen felt heavier than it should have. A fountain pen, navy blue with a thin gold band, Robert's old favorite. Elaine held it between her fingers, poised above the final signature line on Dean's desk. Outside the window, snow fell in soft spirals, muffling the world beyond the glass. Inside, everything was silent except for the faint tick of Dean's clock and the rhythmic sound of the pen tapping once against paper. "You're certain?" Dean asked, his voice steady but cautious. Elaine looked up at him. "Absolutely. His share goes to the foundation, every cent. No loopholes, no re-entry, no appeals." Dean nodded, sliding the trust document toward her. "Once you sign here and initial the amendment, it's irrevocable. Gavin has no legal standing to contest or reverse it." "That's the idea." She signed her name in slow, deliberate strokes. Elaine M. Rivers. The ink bled slightly into the paper, final and permanent. Dean gathered the pages, his motions careful and methodical. "I'll file this today. By tomorrow, the Veterans Charitable Trust will be officially established under your family name." Elaine exhaled through her nose. Robert would have liked that. Dean offered a small smile. He'd have admired the strategy, too. When Elaine stepped out of the law office, the cold hit her like clarity. Her boots crunched over a thin crust of ice as she made her way to her car. The air tasted clean, the kind that followed through only after the hardest decisions. By evening, Marcia was at her kitchen table, a mug of cocoa steaming in her hands as Elaine filled her in. "So it's done," Elaine said, passing her the notarized copy. "He can't touch a penny." Marcia let out a low whistle. "He's gonna explode when he finds out." Elaine stirred her tea, watching the steam curl upward. "He already started imploding the moment he thought he could win." Marcia smirked. "You're colder than a January pond, Lainey." "Just precise," Elaine corrected. "There's a difference." A sudden knock rattled the door, 3 sharp pounds that carried impatience more than politeness. Marcia looked toward the hallway. Speaking of imploding, Elaine rose slowly, every movement measured. When she opened the door, Gavin stood on the porch, snow in his hair, his jaw tight enough to crack. "Mom," he said flatly, "we need clarity." Elaine folded her arms. "About?" He stepped inside without waiting for permission. "Dean sent over some filings today. Says the estate's been redistributed. You signed off on something I never approved." "You don't approve legal documents you're not part of," Elaine said evenly. Gavin's voice sharpened. "This isn't right. You're cutting me out." "No, Gavin." She met his glare without flinching. "You cut yourself out when you contested your father's will." He laughed once, humorless. "You think I'm going to let you manipulate this family's legacy just because Dad left a few fancy clauses?" Elaine turned toward the mantel. On it sat a small wooden box, the one that had held Robert's medals. From inside, she withdrew a folded, handwritten copy of the will. She handed it to him carefully, her hand steady. "You want clarity? Read this." He snatched it from her, scanning the lines quickly, his breathing getting shorter with each paragraph. His eyes stopped on one sentence, the clause Dean had called airtight. "In the event of contest, all rights of inheritance are void." "This is insane," he muttered. "You think a dead man's paranoia gets to rule the living?" "It's not paranoia," she said. "It's foresight. Something you've never learned." He looked up, rage coloring his face. "You'll regret this." Elaine tilted her head slightly. "No, Gavin, you will." For a long second, the house held its breath. Then, without warning, Gavin crumpled the paper in his fist and tossed it toward the fireplace. The flames caught quickly, curling the edges of Robert's words into ash. The room filled with the scent of burning paper, sharp, acrid, final. Marcia, still sitting at the kitchen table, called out from behind him, "Real mature genius. Nothing screams control like throwing a tantrum at your mother's fireplace." Gavin spun toward her, eyes flashing. "Stay out of this." Marcia didn't move. Gladly. Elaine watched the last bit of paper curl into smoke. Her voice was low, steady. "You've proven the point better than I ever could." Gavin turned back toward her, fists tightening, but something in her calm, the absolute absence of fear, made him falter. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, and finally stormed out, the front door slamming hard enough to rattle the glass. Silence returned, broken only by the steady crackle of the fire. Marcia exhaled. "You okay?" Elaine nodded. "More than okay." She reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, the backup copy of Robert's will, digitized and secured. She placed it on the mantel where the ashes still glowed faintly. "Some things burn easy," she said softly, "but not the truth." Marcia looked at her friend for a long moment, a smile slowly forming. "You really don't miss a step, do you?" Elaine shook her head. "Not anymore." The two women stood watching the embers fade, the snow outside thickening against the windows. Then Elaine's phone buzzed on the table. A new message. From Dean. "Transfer complete. Trust is now active. You're officially untouchable." Elaine smiled. Small, quiet, and dangerous. The first snow of February had settled like frost on bone. Quiet, cold, absolute. The streets of Boise gleamed under the dull sheen of afternoon light, and inside the sheriff's office, the air hummed with that restrained energy of professionals handling someone else's family disaster. Elaine sat at the end of the conference table, her purse resting neatly at her feet, her coat folded across the back of her chair. Opposite her, Officer Jen Schultz powered on a small recorder, her uniform immaculate, her tone both warm and official. "Mrs. Rivers," she said, "you understand this meeting's being documented for your protection, correct?" Elaine nodded. "That's why I'm here." On the table between them, she arranged 3 flash drives, a folder of printouts, and a spiral notebook with her husband's initials embossed on the cover. "These are from the security cameras," Elaine said, date-stamped, synchronized with the bank logs, everything that happened after Robert's passing, withdrawals, attempted access, unapproved entries. Officer Jen raised a brow. "You kept all of this?" Elaine met her gaze evenly. "He underestimated what I notice." Before Jen could respond, the door opened and Dean stepped in, carrying a leather briefcase. He nodded respectfully to the officer before setting several notarized forms beside Elaine's materials. "These," Dean said, sliding the top page forward, "are Robert's notarized declarations regarding the trust's amendments. He left explicit statements detailing intent and his soundness of mind at the time of signing." Jen flipped through them quickly, her expression unreadable but impressed. "So, between your documentation and his," she said, "we've got a complete record." Dean adjusted his glasses. "More than complete. We've got evidence strong enough to deter Gavin from pursuing any civil claim, but it's still up to the department whether to flag his filings as fraudulent." Jen leaned back slightly. "I'd say that depends on whether he pushes further." There was a knock at the door. Marcia stepped in, wrapped in a wool coat and determination. "Sorry to barge in," she said. "Elaine wanted me here as a witness." Jen nodded. "Of course, please, have a seat." Marcia sat down beside Elaine, her jaw tight. "You want my statement?" "I'll give it. I saw him. At the funeral. Smirking behind her back like a man who'd just been paroled." Elaine's lips pressed into the faintest curve. Not quite a smile, not yet victory, just acknowledgement. Marcia continued, voice steady. "And later that week, he cornered her on the porch, told her she'd regret taking sides. I heard it. He was mocking her. This wasn't grief. It was greed." Jen's pen scratched steadily across her notepad. "Got it," she said. "That'll go into the official file." When the interviews ended, Jen gathered the documents into a labeled envelope and handed it back to Elaine. "We'll keep digital copies. You hold on to the originals. You're better at that than most." Elaine stood. "Thank you, officer." As she and Dean stepped out into the parking lot, The wind cut sharp and clean between the buildings. Dean exhaled slowly. He's not going to like this. Elaine slipped her gloves on. He doesn't have to like it. He just has to live with it. By the time Gavin received the department's warning letter 2 days later, the tone of his texts had changed, clipped, defensive. This is ridiculous. You didn't have to drag cops into it. We could have handled it privately. Then, another message. Laura thinks maybe I should just apologize. Strategically, for appearances. Elaine didn't reply. She simply set her phone face down on the table and returned to the living room, where the light was soft and the quiet unbroken. The fire had burned low, embers pulsing faintly in the grate. On her lap lay Robert's old leather-bound journal, the one she'd found in the back of his desk drawer after the funeral. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and ink. She turned to a section dated 5 years earlier. If he ever turns this cold toward her, she'll have to be the one to teach him warmth the hard way. Elaine read the line twice. Her fingers lingered over the ink, her throat tightening, but her eyes stayed dry. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the branches against the window. The house was hers, every wall, every file, every piece of proof. She closed the journal carefully, her reflection faint in the glass of the darkened window. "Lessons begun," she whispered. Her phone buzzed again. One final text from Gavin, unreadable under the lock screen glow. Elaine didn't look. She reached out instead, turned off the lamp, and sat in the quiet hum of her husband's memory, waiting for the next move she already knew was coming. The county recorder's office smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, the scent of bureaucracy and finality. Elaine stood at the counter in her winter coat, her gloved hand resting on a manila folder marked Property Title Amendment. Behind her, the fluorescent lights hummed, and the quiet shuffle of documents filled the air like an old clock ticking. "Reason for the update?" the clerk asked, polite but detached. Elaine met her eyes. "Removing a contingent heir," she said evenly, "and retitling the property in my name only." The clerk hesitated just a moment before typing briskly. "And you're the surviving spouse?" "Yes," Elaine said, voice calm. "Executor of the estate." The clerk nodded. "That makes it straightforward." Nothing about this felt straightforward, though. As Elaine signed the final page, she thought of the decades that house had stood. The porch where Robert had hung Christmas lights in the rain, the kitchen where he'd read the morning paper aloud, the small scrape on the hallway molding from Gavin's bike handle. The memories weren't forgiving. They were proof. When the clerk handed her the stamped deed, the red ink gleamed across the top. Sole ownership, E.M. Rivers. Elaine folded it neatly, slipped it into her bag, and exhaled. "Thank you." Outside, the air was sharp enough to sting her lungs. Snowmelt ran in narrow rivers along the curb. She walked to her car, parked crookedly under a bare oak tree, and for the first time in weeks, she let herself smile. A quiet, restrained victory. By afternoon, she sat at her dining table, the deed beside her, the house suddenly feeling lighter, emptier in a good way. She opened her laptop, clicking through the small music school's donation page, Boise Youth Conservatory. Robert had loved music. He'd played trumpet in the Navy band, then volunteered with the local marching program after retirement. "Every kid needs something to make noise about," he used to say. Elaine clicked, "Make a pledge," and in neat keystrokes entered the number she'd already calculated with Dean, 10% of the home's equity, earmarked for instrument scholarships. When she hit submit, the confirmation page flickered on screen, reflecting softly in her glasses. Marcia's voice startled her from behind. "You're donating part of the house?" Elaine turned. Her friend stood in the doorway, coat still dusted with snow. "You really don't waste time, do you?" Elaine smiled faintly. I'm just cleaning up old ownership issues. Marcia grinned. You mean you're kicking his name off the property like yesterday's trash? Something like that. Marcia poured herself coffee, sat down, and leaned forward. He's gonna hate this. He already hates everything that isn't his. Marcia chuckled, shaking her head. He forgot who really paid that mortgage. Before Elaine could respond, tires crunched outside. Through the window, a silver SUV pulled into the driveway, Gavin's. A woman stepped out beside him, clutching a folder and wearing a blazer far too crisp for casual visits. Elaine stood slowly. Real estate agent, she murmured. Marcia blinked. You're kidding. But she wasn't. Gavin was already halfway up the walk, the agent trailing, eyes scanning the yard. Elaine could see the pitch forming on the woman's lips. Square footage, potential, resale. Elaine met them at the front door, her posture unflinching. Mom, Gavin said too brightly, we're just taking a look around, thinking about the market value. You don't have any market value here, Elaine interrupted. Her tone was mild, but her words landed like stones. The agent shifted awkwardly. I'm sorry, ma'am, I was told. Elaine handed her a folded document, freshly notarized. This is the current deed. Sole ownership, no contingencies. You'll want to verify that before you waste your time. The woman scanned the header, eyes widening slightly. Ah, I see. My apologies. She turned to Gavin. Mr. Rivers? This isn't... Don't call me that, Elaine said sharply. Not here. Gavin's jaw flexed. You think you can just... I don't think, she said. It's recorded. He stared at her for a long, stunned second. The agent took a careful step back. We'll, reschedule, she murmured, before retreating to the SUV. Gavin didn't move. You're making a mistake. Elaine tilted her head. I've made plenty. This wasn't one of them. When he finally turned and stalked down the walkway, Marcia appeared beside Elaine, arms crossed. You handled that like a CEO in pearls. Elaine didn't answer. She watched Gavin's taillights disappear into the snow. For a moment, only the sound of the wind filled the house. Then Marcia whispered, almost to herself, You've got your life back, Lainey. Elaine looked around the living room. Robert's photo above the mantel, the folded flag on the shelf, the faint scent of cedar still in the air. My life, she said quietly, and his legacy. She picked up the stamped deed from the table, running her thumb over the red ink. The house that had once been a cage now felt like armor. Her phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. Enjoy the house while it lasts. Elaine stared at it, the screen's glow reflected in her eyes. Her fingers hovered for a second. Then she typed a single reply. I intend to. The next morning, the frost hadn't yet melted from the hedges. A thin film of ice clung to Elaine's mailbox as she pulled the morning paper free, her breath curling in front of her. She didn't plan to read it, not after the headline she'd glimpsed the night before on her phone. Local widow locks out son in estate dispute. The story hadn't quoted her directly, but it didn't have to. She recognized the tone, the condescension, the pity, the quiet thrill of small-town gossip, and she knew where it came from. By the time she stepped into Dean's office an hour later, she'd already rehearsed every word she planned to say. Dean didn't make her use any of them. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk, his expression a mix of caution and something close to satisfaction. Before we start damage control, he said, I found something. Elaine raised a brow. Something good or something worse? Depends on how you look at it. He turned his monitor toward her. The screen displayed an old account ledger from a local credit union. Robert set up a series of certificates of deposit 15 years ago. Legacy account. Reinvesting quarterly. Elaine leaned closer. How much? 90,000, Dean said. Give or take interest. All still active. He named one executor. You. Elaine blinked. And Gavin? Dean shook his head. Not even mentioned. Not once. For a long moment, Elaine said nothing. The hum of the radiator filled the silence. Finally, she whispered. He planned this far ahead. Dean nodded. Robert knew what might happen. He wanted a layer Gavin couldn't touch. Not through probate. Not through civil claim. The account is locked in your name. Elaine's hand drifted to her purse, fingers brushing the edge of her husband's old keychain, the one stamped USS Bonhomme Richard. He was always 2 moves ahead, she murmured. Dean smiled faintly. You're carrying that torch nicely. Back home, she sat at the dining table with her laptop open, sunlight spilling across the wood. Her cursor blinked on a blank donation form, the page titled Boise Youth Conservatory Memorial Endowment. She typed carefully, the Robert L. Rivers Memorial Scholarship Fund, providing music education grants for underprivileged students. It took less than 10 minutes to move the full balance, 10 minutes to transform money into memory and memory into meaning. When the confirmation email arrived, she whispered, "Done," and shut the laptop. The phone rang almost immediately. Marcia, of course. Dean told me, her friend said, not bothering with hello. 90 grand, huh? You sitting there like a Bond villain yet? Elaine laughed softly. Just a widow with good timing. Marcia grinned through the phone. Then I'll drink to that. You, my friend, have pulled off one hell of a checkmate. But the victory didn't stay private for long. That afternoon, Laura's voice exploded through the speaker of Elaine's phone before she could even say hello. You can't just give it away, Laura shrieked. That money belonged to Gavin's father, to this family. Elaine waited for the storm to burn itself out. When it did, she spoke calmly. I am this family, and it wasn't given away. It was put where it can't rot. There was a beat of silence, then a sharp click. Hours later, when the sun fell and the quiet settled back into the house, Elaine's phone buzzed again. A text. Not from Laura, not from Marcia, but from Gavin. I heard what you did. You win. For now. No threats. No gloating. Just a hollow admission, stripped of the venom she'd come to expect. It didn't sound like surrender, more like the breath someone takes before the next punch. Elaine didn't reply. Instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat on the couch, the hum of the heater steady against the windows. For a brief moment, she let herself feel the quiet satisfaction of closure, the kind that didn't require applause. Marcia arrived later with muffins and the local newspaper folded under her arm. Page 4, she said. Small column, but still. Elaine scanned it. Local Memorial Fund honors Navy veteran. Her husband's name printed cleanly beneath the headline. Not a word about Gavin. She folded the paper gently, slid it beneath Robert's photo on the mantel. They sat in silence for a while, the room warm, the fire low. Then a sharp knock rattled the front door. Marcia frowned. Expecting anyone? Elaine shook her head. Through the frosted glass, 2 men stood in dark coats, badges catching the reflection of the porch light. Elaine opened the door a few inches. Officers? The taller one spoke. Mrs. Rivers, we're here to serve notice. Civil action, defamation and breach of privacy, filed under your son's name. Elaine blinked, her heart steady but her breath shallow. Behind her, Marcia muttered, You've got to be kidding. The officer handed her the envelope. You've been named in an online claim regarding the estate. We recommend forwarding this to your attorney. Elaine took the papers calmly. Thank you, she said, closing the door with care. Marcia stared at her. You okay? Elaine's eyes flicked toward the fireplace, where the faint glow from last night's embers reflected off the brass frame of Robert's photo. She set the notice on the table beside her coffee and smiled, slow, deliberate, dangerous. "I told you," she said quietly, the lessons still being learned. The morning the first headline hit, Elaine was already sitting in Dean's office with a folder under her arm and a calmness that unnerved even him. Across town, Gavin had posted a Facebook statement, a slick paragraph dressed up as concern, dripping with self-pity. "Hardest months of my life. Watching an elderly parent struggle alone after losing dad and being cut out of everything by legal manipulation. I just pray for transparency." The comments poured in: sympathy, outrage, gossip. And beneath the words, something worse: Gavin's followers speculating about financial abuse. Dean read it aloud, jaw tightening. "He's walking a very thin legal line." Elaine handed him a flash drive. "He crossed it 2 nights ago." Dean inserted it, and a video appeared on his monitor. Security footage from Elaine's door camera. Time-stamped. Clear audio. Gavin's voice, angry, sharp. "You're stealing what's mine." Followed by Elaine's even response. "It was never yours, Gavin. Your father made sure of that." Then, Gavin lunging forward, hand raised, stopped only by Marcia stepping between them, her voice firm and cold. "Back off before she makes this official." Dean exhaled, leaning back. "You realize this video clears you of every implication he's made? That's why I saved it," she said. He picked up the phone, dialed. "I'm filing today. We're suing for damages, defamation, slander, and emotional distress." Elaine said nothing, just folded her hands in her lap and stared out the window. Outside, snow was melting off the gutters, dripping slow and rhythmic like the ticking of a metronome. Within 48 hours, Officer Jen Schultz was at her house, recording a formal statement. She clicked her pen twice, tone clipped but respectful. "The posts are being archived," Jen said. "Screenshots, server timestamps, everything. His phrasing implies you manipulated funds and isolated him from assets. That's actionable under state law." Elaine poured 2 cups of tea, sliding one across the table. "Then make it actionable." Jen smiled faintly. "I already have." 3 days later, a thick envelope landed on Gavin's doorstep. Notice of civil suit. Rivers for Rivers. By the following week, gossip had shifted again. The once sympathetic tone of online comments turned brittle as Dean's office released the footage publicly through the court filing. The video hit social media in hours, and the narrative inverted overnight. Elaine hadn't needed to say a word. The truth had its own kind of volume. When Gavin finally sat across from Dean's conference table, the fight had gone out of him. His lawyer, a young man with nervous hands, shuffled papers, cleared his throat, and said what Elaine already knew was coming. "Mrs. Rivers," the lawyer began, "we'd like to discuss the possibility of a quiet settlement." Dean adjusted his glasses. "A settlement requires mutual agreement. So far, you've offered nothing worth considering." The lawyer looked to Gavin, then back to Elaine. "Public retraction, formal apology. We'll cover your legal costs." Dean leaned forward, but Elaine lifted a hand. "Let him speak," she said softly. The lawyer swallowed. "We understand your reputation matters to you. It was never Gavin's intent to—" "To what?" Elaine interrupted, her voice still calm. "Destroy what his father built? To humiliate his mother because he couldn't manipulate her anymore?" The room went still. Gavin's eyes darted away. Elaine turned to him. "You thought the world would believe you? That they'd pity you? But you forgot the difference between sympathy and respect." For a moment, the old confidence flickered behind Gavin's expression. "You won't win sympathy either," he said. Elaine smiled faintly. "I'm not trying to." Dean slid a new document across the table. "Here's our counteroffer," he said. "A formal public apology, typed, signed, and posted on every platform where the defamation appeared. Only then will Mrs. Rivers agree to drop the suit. The young lawyer hesitated, then nodded. That's fair. Gavin stared at the paper for a long moment. You're really doing this, he said quietly. Elaine's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm finishing it. When they left the office, Dean walked her to the elevator. You don't have to accept the apology, you know, he said. You could take him for everything. Elaine smiled. He's already lost everything worth taking. By the next morning, the apology appeared online, short, stiff, stripped of sincerity but signed in his own name. I apologize to my mother, Elaine Rivers, for false and damaging statements I made regarding my late father's estate. My comments were irresponsible, and I regret the harm caused. Laura's comment appeared under it within minutes. You cost us everything. Elaine read it once, then closed the page. Later that evening, she brewed 2 mugs of coffee as Marcia settled on the couch beside her. Marcia lifted her mug. To strategy. Elaine clinked hers gently. To precision. Outside, the snow started again, a fresh, silent layer covering the footprints from earlier that day. Her phone vibrated once on the table. A new email. She glanced at the subject line. Notice of compliance. Defendant's assets frozen pending review. Dean had moved faster than even she expected. Elaine's reflection caught in the window. Serene, resolute, untouchable. By late March, the snow was gone from the gutters, replaced by the sound of rain sliding through the downspouts. The world was thawing, and so, in a way, was Elaine's house. The tension that had once lived in its walls, the whispers, the waiting, had given way to quiet motion. Boxes lined the hallway, Robert's tools, military flags, books to donate. The air smelled faintly of cardboard, lemon polish, and closure. She folded his navy flag one final time, the blue field perfect, the stars aligned just as he'd shown her years ago. She placed it gently inside a wooden display case, then added it to the donation stack for the Veterans Memorial Hall. Marcia entered through the back door, shaking off rain from her jacket. You've been at this since sunrise, she said, eyeing the boxes. You ever gonna sit down? Elaine smiled faintly. I'll rest when it's all in the right hands. Translation, Marcia said, hanging her coat. You're making sure Gavin can't claim a damn screwdriver. Elaine gave a soft laugh. That too. She crossed to the living room, where Robert's old collection of first edition novels sat in neat rows. She ran a finger over their spines, Hemingway, Steinbeck, Faulkner, and then began sliding them carefully into a box labeled Library Donation. The doorbell rang. Elaine froze for a moment before glancing at Marcia. If that's him again? Marcia raised a brow. Then I'll handle it. But when Elaine opened the door, it wasn't Gavin. It was Derek. He stood on the porch, his hands shoved into the pockets of his windbreaker, his sneakers wet from the rain. 16 now. Taller, sharper features, but still carrying the same quiet unease she remembered from family dinners when his father's temper flared. Hi, Grandma, he said softly. Elaine's voice warmed. Derek, come in. He stepped inside, eyes darting to the donation boxes. You're giving it all away? Most of it, she said. Things that belong in hands that'll appreciate them. He hesitated. Dad says you're trying to erase him. Elaine sighed. No, sweetheart. I'm just making sure he doesn't erase what your grandfather stood for. Derek nodded slowly, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. We had to write essays at school about integrity. I kind of wrote it about you. Elaine blinked, the paper trembling slightly as she took it. The handwriting was messy, the sentences simple but sincere. Integrity isn't about being nice. It's about standing your ground even when people call you cruel. My grandmother did that. She's the only adult in our family who tells the truth. When she looked up, Derek was watching her with that mix of teenage defiance and fragile hope. "You're the only adult in this family," he said quietly. The words hit her harder than any accusation Gavin had thrown. Elaine reached forward, pulling him into a hug, not tentative, not polite, but full, solid, grounding. His damp jacket pressed cold against her sweater, but she didn't care. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," she whispered. "So am I." When he finally pulled back, his eyes were glassy but steady. "Dad's not doing great. I just thought you should know." Elaine nodded. "I figured as much." They stood there in silence a moment longer before she handed him a sealed envelope from the side table. "This is for your college fund," she said. "Not a penny of it from him. All earned the right way." He tried to protest, but she stopped him with a look. "Take it. Use it for something good." When he left, the house felt full again. Not with ghosts, but with purpose. Marcia appeared from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Kid's got more backbone than his father ever did." Elaine smiled. "He's the only one who listened." Marcia nodded toward her laptop. "Speaking of listening, the scholarship website's live. Check it out." Elaine sat beside her, and together they watched the page load. The Robert L. Rivers Memorial Scholarship Fund. A photo of her husband in uniform, trumpet in hand, smiling. Below it, Marcia had written, "For those who serve, create, and never forget the sound of honor." Elaine's eyes glistened. "It's perfect." Marcia raised her coffee mug. "To legacies that matter." Elaine clinked hers softly. "And to letting go of the ones that don't." Outside, the low hum of an engine rolled down the street. Elaine turned her head. Gavin's car, creeping past the house. His window was down, his face pale and tight. He didn't wave. Elaine stood by the window, watching as he slowed, hesitated, then drove on. The taillights vanished into the drizzle. Marcia crossed her arms. "You gonna wave?" "No." Elaine reached up, turning the deadbolt with a clean click. "That chapter's closed." She looked around the room one last time, the empty shelves, the folded flag, the framed scholarship certificate on the table. Everything that mattered was preserved. Everything else had burned away. The rain thickened outside, steady and endless. Elaine closed the curtains. The house wrapped once again in quiet peace. The morning of the ceremony dawned mild and gray, with a thin veil of mist hanging over the yard. Elaine stood at the kitchen sink, watching it roll across her rose garden, the place Robert had loved most. Even now, she could hear him teasing her about overwatering, about spacing the bushes too close, about never remembering the Latin names he'd drilled into her. She smiled faintly, touching the edge of his wedding ring that now hung from a ribbon around her neck. The ashes waited on the counter in a small bronze urn. Simple, unadorned, the way he'd wanted it. Marcia arrived first, carrying a stack of folding chairs and a thermos of coffee. "The florist dropped off the wreaths," she said, voice brisk to hide the emotion underneath. "And the pastor's running 5 minutes late, which feels appropriate for Robert." Elaine chuckled softly. He never did like punctual people. By noon, a handful of friends from the Veterans Center and the local library gathered among the rose bushes. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and the faint sweetness of thawing soil. Birds flitted across the fence line, curious but quiet. Derek stood near the arbor, a thin notebook in his trembling hands. He'd insisted on reading something. A poem he'd written for the scholarship dedication. His mother hadn't come. His father hadn't been invited. Elaine met his eyes, nodding once, steadying him. When the guests settled, Derek stepped forward, voice small but clear. "Not every man leaves his mark in marble. Some leave it in the air they taught us to breathe, some in the sound of a horn echoing over the water, and some in the garden, where love keeps growing, even after hands stop tending." Silence followed, deep and respectful. Someone sniffled quietly in the back. Elaine closed her eyes, the words weaving through her like a benediction. When she opened them again, she stepped forward to the memorial tree, the small maple Robert had planted the first spring after their wedding. Its bark was rough beneath her fingers, its branches already budding. She placed his watch at the base of the trunk, the leather strap still faintly creased from his wrist. Then she took off the wedding band from the ribbon around her neck and set it beside the watch. 45 years, she whispered. You stayed true to every promise, even the ones I didn't know you made. Marcia approached quietly, a folded paper in her hand. I brought something, she said, from his will. You'll know the line. She unfolded it carefully, her voice catching just once before steadying. For the one who never forgot how to stay. Elaine's breath hitched. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Simple, final, endless in their ripple. There was a quiet chorus of sniffles around the garden. One of Robert's old Navy friends placed a hand over his heart. Derek wiped his eyes on his sleeve, pretending not to. Elaine turned to the small crowd. Thank you for coming, she said softly. He didn't believe in big ceremonies. He believed in showing up, in loyalty, in doing what needed to be done, even when no one clapped for it. That's how I want him remembered. Marcia stepped closer, looping her arm through Elaine's. He's remembered that way already. As the guests drifted back toward the porch for coffee and quiet conversation, Elaine lingered by the tree. The urn now rested beneath it, half buried among the rose roots. She reached down, pressing her hand into the soil. Rest easy, sailor, she whispered. I kept the ship steady. A gust of wind stirred the petals of the wreaths, sending a few pale pink roses tumbling across the lawn. Behind her, Derek approached. He'd like this, he said. Elaine smiled. He'd complain about the chairs being crooked, but yes, he'd like it. They both laughed softly. The sound carried up, mingling with the breeze. When the last car pulled away, Elaine and Marcia began folding the chairs, moving in practiced silence. From the corner of her eye, Elaine saw a familiar shape at the edge of the street. A silver sedan idling. Gavin. He didn't get out. Didn't roll the window down. Just sat there, engine running, watching from a distance. Elaine straightened, meeting his gaze across the yard. For a heartbeat, she thought he might step out. But he didn't. He drove off slowly, the car disappearing behind the curve of the street. Marcia followed her gaze. He really doesn't know when to quit, does he? Elaine shook her head, turning back to the garden. No, but someday he'll have to. She brushed soil from her hands, the faint smear of earth grounding her. The rose bushes swayed lightly in the wind, the first new buds trembling at their tips. Marcia placed a hand on her shoulder. You ready to go inside? Elaine looked once more at the tree, the watch, the ring, the urn beneath the soil. Not yet, she said. I want to watch it grow a little longer. Rain slicked the pavement outside Elaine's window, streaking the glass like gray ribbons. She sat at her desk, the cursor blinking on a blank email draft addressed to Gavin Rivers. For nearly an hour, she'd written and deleted the same 2 sentences. I hope you find peace someday. Then, you brought this on yourself. Neither felt true. Neither felt enough. She exhaled, fingers hovering above the keyboard. Finally, she began typing. Not the apology he wanted, not the closure he'd ever understand, but the truth he'd spent his life avoiding. You always mistook kindness for weakness. You thought control was love, and winning was the same as respect. Your father tried to teach you integrity, but you learned imitation instead. You've inherited nothing, Gavin, because you've earned nothing. Her chest tightened as she read it back. The words pulsed on the screen like small contained flames. She reached for the mouse, hesitated, then clicked delete. The empty screen glowed at her in silence. She closed the laptop, folded her hands, and whispered to herself, "Some words don't need to be sent to be heard." By noon, she was sitting in Dean's office again, the same one where this had all begun. The familiar scent of leather and printer toner hung in the air. Dean was already waiting with a folder open on his desk, the title stamped across the top in formal, unfeeling font, "Permanent Disinheritance, Addendum to Living Trust." "Once you sign this," he said gently, "there's no reversal. Gavin will be excluded from every asset, account, or trust tied to your estate. Not even probate court could reopen it." Elaine nodded. "Good." Dean hesitated. "You're certain? Even after the apology?" "Especially after it," she said, her tone cool but steady. "He apologized to salvage his pride, not his conscience." He slid the pen toward her. "Then let's make it official." Elaine signed with deliberate care. Elaine M. Rivers, ink sinking into the paper like a verdict. When she finished, Dean countersigned, then sealed the document into a fireproof envelope. "It's done," he said. She sat back, exhaling slowly. "I thought it would feel cruel." "And does it?" She looked at him, weary, calm, unflinching. "No, it feels like balance." Dean studied her a moment, then said softly, "He doesn't even know what he lost." Elaine's gaze drifted toward the rain-streaked window. "He knows," she murmured. "That's the punishment." Later that afternoon, back in her den, Elaine unlocked the small fire safe beneath her husband's desk. Inside were the keepsakes she refused to display. The last photo of Robert and Gavin together, an old baseball mitt, a faded Father's Day card that said, "Best Dad Ever," in a boy's uneven handwriting. She set them aside carefully, then added a single new item, a letter. The envelope wasn't sealed yet. Inside, she'd written one page, her handwriting neat and measured. "You could have been a son to be proud of. You chose to be a lesson instead. I won't hate you, Gavin. Hate would mean you still take up space in my heart. I've chosen peace instead. That's the only thing you'll never own." She slipped it into the envelope, wrote his name across the front, and then locked it inside the safe. The click of the latch echoed softly in the quiet house. Marcia arrived just as dusk was falling, carrying 2 cups of coffee and her usual blunt honesty. "Heard you went to Dean's again," she said, setting the mugs down. "So it's done?" Elaine nodded. Marcia whistled low. "That's mercy, not weakness." Elaine's lips curved faintly. "I know. Mercy's heavier. You carry it longer." They sat together in silence, the room bathed in the amber light of the fireplace. Outside, thunder grumbled distantly, low and uncertain. Marcia sipped her coffee. "You ever think he'll call again?" "No," Elaine said quietly. "He's too proud, and too broken to admit it." A knock at the door interrupted them. Elaine rose, cautious. Through the glass, she saw Officer Jen Schultz, rain dripping from the brim of her hat. "Evening, Mrs. Rivers," Jen said. "Sorry to stop by unannounced." Elaine frowned. "Everything all right?" Jen hesitated. "Depends how you define it. I thought you should hear this from me before it hits the record. Your son, Gavin, filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy this morning." Elaine blinked once, then again, her hands tightening around the edge of the door. Jen continued gently. "It's bad, Elaine. Foreclosure pending. Creditors lined up. He listed total assets at under $1,500. For a long moment, Elaine said nothing. Then, with a small nod, she asked, "Is he safe?" "As far as I know." "Good," she said softly. "That's enough." Jen studied her a moment longer, then gave a respectful nod and walked back into the rain. Elaine closed the door slowly, locking it behind her. Marcia's voice came from the living room. What was that? Elaine turned, her face unreadable. Just a storm passing through. Marcia tilted her head. Lainey. Elaine walked to the window, watching as the streetlights flickered on, casting golden halos in the drizzle. He wanted freedom, she said quietly. And now he has it, the kind that comes with nothing left to lose. Marcia didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. The two women stood together, the sound of the rain thick and steady against the glass. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, not threatening this time, just inevitable. Elaine reached for her coffee and took a slow sip, her reflection faint in the dark window pane. In that reflection, she no longer saw a widow or a mother. She saw a survivor. Dusk fell soft and slow over Boise, the sky painted in muted violets and ash-blue haze. The air smelled faintly of rain and cut grass, that quiet perfume of endings that didn't ache anymore. Elaine walked through her garden, the soil damp beneath her shoes, a single candle flickering in her hand. She paused at the maple tree, Robert's tree, where the rose bushes had begun to bloom again. The buds were red this time, not pale pink, defiant against the lingering chill. She knelt and set the candle in a small glass holder beside the roots. Its flame wavered, then steadied, casting a faint gold halo against the engraved plaque nearby. Robert L. Rivers, for the one who never forgot how to stay. Elaine brushed a leaf from the plaque and smiled, her breath visible in the cool air. The ache that had once lived permanently in her chest had softened into something quieter, almost tender. From the road, a delivery truck turned the corner and pulled up beside the house. The driver, a young man with sleeves rolled past his elbows, carried a large flat box toward her. "Mrs. Rivers?" he asked. "Yes. Got a delivery for you. Says Memorial Bench, custom engraving. Want me to leave it here?" Elaine nodded. "Please." He set it down gently and handed her the clipboard to sign. When the truck's engine faded, she stood staring at the unopened box for a long moment before cutting it open with her pruning shears. The bench was beautiful, simple cedar, smooth to the touch, engraved in clean, careful letters. In loving memory of Sam Dier. Robert L. Rivers, U.S. Navy, duty before self. She ran her fingers over the lettering, tracing the words until her hand stilled. Then she carried the bench, slowly, methodically, to the small clearing beside the maple tree. Her knees ached, her hands trembled, but she managed to set it perfectly level. When she finally sat down, the candlelight caught the edge of her wedding band. The new one she'd bought herself 2 weeks earlier. It wasn't meant as replacement. It was a symbol of survival. From inside the house, the clock chimed 7. Elaine took a deep breath, savoring the stillness. No phone buzzing, no paperwork waiting, no footsteps pounding in anger. Just quiet, earned and absolute. After a few minutes, she pulled a piece of stationery from her pocket, the kind she reserved for things that mattered. She began to write, the ink flowing easily across the page. Dear Marcus, congratulations on becoming the first recipient of the Robert L. Rivers Memorial Scholarship. Your essay about perseverance struck a chord with me. My late husband believed that service and art both demand discipline. One protects the world, the other reminds it why it's worth protecting. I believe you'll do both. Use this opportunity well. Make noise, stay humble, keep learning how to stay. With pride, Elaine M. Rivers. She folded the letter carefully, sliding it into an envelope. On the front she wrote in steady script, Boise Youth Conservatory. Aten. Marcus H. A soft voice broke the quiet behind her. That's a beautiful letter. Elaine turned to see Derek standing by the gate, holding a bouquet of fresh irises. His jacket was too big for him, his hair wind-tossed. She smiled. You always show up right when I need a reminder that good still runs in this family. He grinned shyly. I brought these? They're from Mom's garden? She said you'd know what to do with them. Elaine accepted the flowers, their petals damp and fragrant. Tell your mother I appreciate that. Derek hesitated, then added, Dad moved out. He's renting a small apartment near the river. Mom said it's better this way. Elaine nodded. No satisfaction in her voice, only acceptance. Peace comes in strange shapes. He looked at the bench, then at her. Grandpa would have liked this. He would, she said softly. He always needed something to fix, even when it wasn't broken. Derek smiled, then hugged her quickly before heading back down the path. Thanks for everything, Grandma. Elaine watched him go until his silhouette disappeared beyond the gate. The candle still burned beside the tree, its flames small but defiant against the wind. Inside, the house was warm, faintly lit. The scent of chamomile drifted from the kitchen. Elaine placed the irises in a vase on the counter, then paused at the window. Outside, the garden glowed faintly in the last of the dusk. She whispered to the empty room, It's done now, Robert. It's really done. That night she slept deeply. No dreams, no ghosts, no echoes of slammed doors or whispered arguments. Just rest. The kind of rest that only comes when everything owed has finally been settled. Sometime after midnight, the rain began again. Soft, rhythmic, like a lullaby against the windows. But before sleep took her entirely, Elaine's phone buzzed once on the nightstand. A new email alert, the subject line half visible through tired eyes. Notice of hearing, Bankruptcy Court of Ada County. Her breath steadied. She didn't open it. Instead, she reached over, silenced the phone, and whispered into the dark. Let the court have him now. The candle outside, forgotten on the garden table, flickered once, then went out. The evening sun spilled through the kitchen window in slow golden sheets, turning the countertops to amber and the air to memory. Elaine arranged the table with quiet precision. 3 plates, cloth napkins folded neatly, the silver polished until it caught the light like small mirrors. Outside, the garden hummed softly with life. The roses had opened fully that morning, their scent drifting through the cracked windows as if Robert himself had sent the breeze to check in. Marcia arrived first, tapping twice on the door before letting herself in. She wore her usual sharp cardigan and carried a bottle of Cabernet. If we're toasting your husband, she said, we're doing it properly. Of course, Elaine said, taking the bottle with a smile. You know he never cared for wine. That's why I brought it, Marcia replied. More for us. A few minutes later, Dean arrived, his briefcase traded for a small paper bag. I didn't come empty-handed, he said, pulling out a loaf of fresh bread and a jar of honey. The farmer's market said this batch was the sweetest of the season. Figured that fit the occasion. Elaine took them both, warmth rising behind her eyes. It does, she said softly. Thank you, Dean. They ate slowly, comfortably, laughter drifting through the dining room, gentle and unforced. No talk of legal filings or bank accounts. No mention of Gavin or bankruptcy or wounds best left closed. Only small stories. Robert's obsession with Navy punctuality. The time he tried to install the porch light upside down. The way he'd tap his wedding ring against his coffee mug every morning before reading the paper. Marcia raised her glass first. To Robert, she said, not for leaving, but for teaching us how to stay. Dean lifted his as well. To discipline, loyalty, and the kind of foresight I'll be talking about in probate law seminars for the next decade. Elaine smiled, her voice steady but rich with feeling. To peace. The kind we build, not the kind we wait for. They clinked glasses, and for a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind brushing against the rose bushes outside, and the faint, familiar hum of Robert's old wall clock in the hallway. After dinner, Dean excused himself to take a call, and Marcia wandered into the living room to study the photos on the mantel. Elaine lingered at the old record player in the corner, fingers grazing the worn leather sleeve of one of Robert's favorites. Glenn Miller, Moonlight Serenade. She set the record on the turntable, the needle crackling softly before the first notes filled the room. It was warm, nostalgic, alive. The kind of sound that could make a person believe time had softened its edges. When Marcia re-entered, she was holding the folded flag from the shelf. "This still feels too heavy," she said quietly. Elaine took it gently, cradling the triangular fold against her chest. "It's not weight," she murmured. "It's everything that's left." Dean returned just as the song shifted. He paused in the doorway, listening. "I haven't heard that since your anniversary party," he said. Elaine smiled. He played it every year after that. Said it was the only song that made sense of love and patience in the same breath. They stood together, silent through the rest of the tune. When it ended, Elaine didn't flip the record. She let the needle hum in the quiet. The roses outside glowed faintly in the twilight, bright red, defiant against the encroaching dark. The same red as the scarf Marcia had worn at the funeral, the same red Robert used to claim was the color of people who keep their promises. Elaine crossed to the mantel and checked her phone out of habit. A new message lit the screen. She opened it, a photo of Derek, grinning ear to ear, holding a thick envelope in his hands. "Accepted, Boise State." Beneath it, a short line of text. "Thank you for teaching me what family actually means." Elaine's lips parted in a quiet exhale. "That boy," she whispered. Marcia smiled knowingly. "He's the proof you did something right." Dean glanced toward the window. "And the proof Robert's legacy won't end with a court order." Elaine set the phone down beside the flag and poured the last of the wine into 3 glasses. "Then we'll drink to that," she said. They raised their glasses once more, the clink soft, but sure. "To freedom," Elaine said. "To freedom," Dean echoed. Marcia's eyes softened. "The good kind," Elaine nodded, her voice steady. "The earned kind." When they finally left, the house settled into a comfortable hush. The fire burned low in the hearth, the record still turning faintly in the corner. Elaine sat on the rug before the fireplace, the flag resting in her lap. She traced the stitches absently, her reflection flickering in the glass of the framed photograph above. Robert in uniform, smiling that restrained, proud smile that had once anchored her through everything. Outside, the roses moved in the wind like red lanterns. Elaine whispered, "You were right, Robert. Freedom's not a gift. It's a letting go." She stood, walked to the window, and unlatched it. The wind swept in gently, carrying the scent of roses and rain. For a moment, she closed her eyes and simply breathed. Then, with a quiet smile, she whispered the final truth. Words meant for no one but him. He wanted freedom, so I gave him his inheritance and let it blow away like ashes in the wind. The record ended on a soft crackle. The candle in the garden guttered once, and the night fell still. The kind of still that wasn't emptiness, but peace finally earned.